My name is Bianca Foster. I'm 33 years old. And the night my marriage actually ended wasn't the night my husband gave me an ultimatum in front of his entire family. It was the 3 seconds of silence that followed his mother screaming about a car instead of about me. We were at his parents' house for Sunday dinner, the kind his family had been hosting every week for as long as I'd been married into it. I'd said something, I'll get to exactly what, and my husband Grant stood up from the table, pointed at me and said, "Apologize right now or get out." I didn't apologize. I picked up my purse, walked to the front hallway, and grabbed my keys off the console table. And as I opened the front door, his mother, Diane, shot up from her seat and screamed across the dining room, "Not the Porsche. That car is not leaving this driveway." Nobody said my name. Nobody asked where I was going or if I was okay, or whether this was really how the evening was going to end. The only thing anyone in that house seemed to care about losing was a car with a lease payment neither of them had ever once helped cover. Before I tell you what happened over the next 6 weeks, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from? I want to know how far this one travels. Grant and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party 4 years ago. He was charming in the specific way that takes you a while to notice is also controlling. He complimented my opinions before he'd really heard them, laughed at my jokes a bit too enthusiastically, made me feel in those early months like I'd finally found someone who saw me clearly. It took about 2 years of marriage for me to understand that what I'd mistaken for being seen was actually being managed. I'm a structural engineer, the kind of job that requires precision and doesn't leave much room for being talked out of facts. I liked at first that Grant's family was close-knit. Sunday dinners, holidays that took real planning. A mother who remembered everyone's birthday down to the specific bakery order. What I slowly understood was that close-knit in the Foster family meant something closer to a single unit that operates by consensus, and the consensus is always whatever Diane wants. Diane Foster had strong opinions about everything. How I should dress for family events, how I should speak to Grant's father, whether my career made sense alongside Grant's plans for their future. Grant rarely disagreed with her openly. He'd just relay her opinions to me as though they were reasonable requests, and get quietly frustrated when I pushed back. The Porsche came into the picture 18 months ago. It was mine, bought with money I'd earned, a bonus from a bridge redesign project that had gone well beyond expectations, plus savings I'd built up since college. I'd wanted one car in my adult life that was purely, unapologetically mine, something nobody else's name was attached to, something I hadn't needed anyone's permission to buy. Grant had been lukewarm about it at the time. A little flashy for us, he'd said, which even then felt like a strange thing to say about a purchase made entirely with my own money. The dinner that ended everything started ordinarily enough. Diane was recounting, for what felt like the 40th time, a story about a family friend's daughter who'd just gotten engaged, the kind of story that always circled back, eventually, to a pointed comment about Grant and me not having started a family yet. "Some women just know how to prioritize what matters," Diane said, looking not quite at me but close enough that the intention was clear. I'd absorbed comments like that for years, mostly by staying quiet and changing the subject. That night, exhausted from a 60-hour work week and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, I didn't stay quiet. "I do know how to prioritize what matters," I said. "I've been prioritizing a career that pays for half of everything in our house, including actually more than half of the down payment on this dining room we're sitting in." That last part wasn't strictly necessary to say. Grant and I had helped his parents with a renovation loan 2 years earlier, quietly, without ever expecting acknowledgement. But in the moment, tired and cornered, I said it anyway. The table went quiet. Grant's father suddenly found his water glass extremely interesting. Diane's face did something complicated. Not quite anger yet, more like recalibration. "That's not the point of what I said," Diane said, her voice tightening. "I know exactly what the point of what you said was," I replied. That's when Grant stood up. "Bianca apologized to my mother," he said. Not a question. Not even really addressed to me as a person he was married to. Addressed to me the way you'd address an employee who'd embarrassed the company in front of a client. I looked at him for a long moment, and something in me went very still and very clear. The way things sometimes do right before you understand you've already made a decision without fully realizing it. "For what, exactly?" I asked. "For pointing out that I contribute to this family financially just as much as I'm apparently expected to contribute." "Silence." "You're being disrespectful," Grant said. "Apologize or get out. I want to be honest about something." In that moment, I wasn't thinking about our 4 years of marriage or the wedding or the mortgage, or any of the practical entanglements that should have made this decision harder than it felt. I was thinking about how many Sunday dinners I'd sat through absorbing comments like Diane's, and how the first time I'd actually pushed back, my husband's immediate instinct wasn't to ask what was going on with me. It was to side, instantly and completely, with his mother. "Okay," I said. And I meant it as an answer, not a surrender. I picked up my purse from the back of my chair, walked into the front hallway, and took my keys off the console table where I'd set them 2 hours earlier. That's when Diane, who I don't think had processed yet that I was actually leaving rather than storming off to cool down in the yard, saw me heading toward the front door with my keys in hand, and shot up from her chair. "Not the Porsche!" she screamed, loud enough that I heard it clearly from the hallway, loud enough that I'm fairly sure the neighbors heard it too. "That car is not leaving this driveway. Grant, tell her that car is not leaving." I stood there for a second, hand on the door, absorbing what had just happened. My husband had just told me to apologize or leave our family gathering entirely. And in the 3 seconds that followed, the loudest, most urgent reaction from anyone in that house wasn't about me leaving. It was about a car. Nobody in that dining room had contributed a single dollar to that car. It wasn't registered to Grant, wasn't insured under any family policy, wasn't, in any legal or practical sense, anyone's business but mine. And yet in the moment that should have been about a marriage possibly ending, the collective panic of the room organized itself entirely around an asset. I turned around, looked at Diane and said calmly, "The car is mine. I bought it. I'm taking it." Then I looked at Grant, who hadn't moved from his spot at the table, who hadn't said a single word since his mother started screaming, who seemed, in that moment, more concerned with managing the escalating scene than with the fact that his wife was actually walking out the door. "Are you seriously not going to say anything?" I asked him. He looked at his mother, then back at me and said, Can we talk about this without making a whole thing out of it?" I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I finally understood with total clarity exactly where I ranked in the hierarchy of that family's priorities. I opened the door, walked to my car and drove away. I didn't go home that night. Home at that point felt like a place I needed distance from, not comfort in. I checked into a hotel, sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on, and sat with the strange, cold clarity of understanding that something fundamental had just ended, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. Grant texted twice that night. The first message said, "That got out of hand, come home so we can talk." The second, an hour later, said, "My mom is really upset, she thinks you're being dramatic about the car thing." Neither message asked how I was doing. Neither message acknowledged that he'd told me to apologize or leave, in front of his entire family, over a comment I'd made that was, at worst, blunt. Both messages were, in their own way, about managing his mother's feelings and getting the situation back under control, which had apparently always been my job, whether or not I'd agreed to take it. I didn't respond that night. The next morning, I called a family law attorney a colleague had recommended years earlier, mostly as a joke, when we were commiserating about difficult in-laws. I hadn't expected to actually need the number. Over the following weeks, working with my attorney Renata Cole, I did something I probably should have done much earlier in the marriage. I actually looked clearly and unemotionally at the financial structure of our life together. What I found wasn't shocking exactly, but it was clarifying. I'd contributed significantly more to our joint expenses than Grant had for the past 2 years, largely because his contribution to a family investment fund, money that, it turned out, mostly flowed toward his parents' renovation projects and occasional emergencies, had quietly eaten into what should have been our shared savings. I'd never questioned it closely because Grant had always framed it as helping family, the same framing his mother used for everything she wanted from us. The Porsche, thankfully, was unambiguous, purchased entirely with my own funds, registered solely in my name, financed through my own credit. There was no question, legally or otherwise, about who it belonged to. Diane's scream in that hallway had been, in the most literal sense, about nothing. She had no claim to that car whatsoever. She just, in the panic of the moment, revealed exactly what she actually valued enough to fight for. Grant called several times over the next 2 weeks, oscillating between apologetic and frustrated. At one point he said, "I didn't mean it like an ultimatum, I just wanted you to smooth things over with my mom. That's how we've always handled things." I asked him why smoothing things over always meant me apologizing, and never once in 4 years meant his mother reconsidering how she spoke to me. He didn't have an answer. Diane called once, not to apologize but to ask, with genuine confusion in her voice, why I was punishing the whole family over one comment at dinner. I explained as calmly as I could that I wasn't punishing anyone. I was responding to the fact that my own husband had given me an ultimatum in front of a room full of people, and that the loudest reaction to me actually leaving had been about a car rather than about me. The car is a symbol of everything wrong with your priorities, Diane said, which struck me as an almost impressively self-unaware thing to say, given that she was the one who'd screamed about it. I didn't file for divorce immediately, mostly because I wanted to be certain I was making a clear-headed decision rather than an emotional one made in the heat of a bad dinner. I gave it 6 weeks, living separately, working, thinking, going to 2 sessions with a therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of family of origin entanglement. What became clear over those 6 weeks wasn't really about the dinner or the car at all. It was about a pattern I'd been quietly absorbing for 4 years, that in any conflict between me and Grant's family, Grant's automatic position was to manage me into compliance rather than to advocate for me. The ultimatum at dinner wasn't an aberration. It was the clearest, most public version of something that had been happening quietly for years. I filed for divorce at the end of those 6 weeks. Grant seemed genuinely surprised, which told me almost everything I needed to know about how little he'd actually understood what had broken. The divorce process itself was relatively straightforward, precisely because the Porsche situation was so unambiguous. There was simply nothing to argue about regarding an asset that had never been shared to begin with. Grant's attorney at one point actually raised the question of whether the car should be considered marital property given that it had been used for family events, which my attorney dismantled in about 4 sentences by pointing out that driving to Sunday dinner doesn't transfer ownership. I kept the house we'd bought together, buying out Grant's share with a loan against my own savings. I kept my career, which had never actually needed his family's approval to succeed regardless of how often it had been questioned at that dinner table. And I kept the car, obviously, which had never been anyone's to take in the first place. Diane sent one message months later through Grant, asking whether I'd consider staying civil for the sake of extended family events going forward. I told Grant that I'd be perfectly civil, from exactly the distance that seemed appropriate given everything that had happened. I think about that scream in the hallway more than I probably should. Not the Porsche. It's such a small, almost comic detail against the backdrop of an entire marriage ending, but it ended up being the clearest single moment of the whole relationship. In the space of about 3 seconds, an entire family's priorities revealed themselves without a shred of performance or diplomacy. Nobody managed their reaction. Nobody thought about how it looked. The truest thing anyone in that house valued in the moment it mattered most was a piece of property that had never belonged to any of them. I don't regret grabbing my keys that night, and I don't regret looking back, that the drive away from that house was the first completely clear-headed decision I'd made in that marriage in a long time. Sometimes the truth about a relationship doesn't arrive in a long, painful conversation. Sometimes it arrives in 3 seconds, in a scream about a car, in the specific and telling silence of everyone who should have said something else instead. If you've ever been in a room where the people who were supposed to care about you revealed without meaning to what they actually cared about more, you already understand exactly why I never looked back toward that driveway again.